think that with all the turbulent changes and all the chaos happening in the world, if you boil it down, and increasingly you can boil it down to a plot line that's remarkably simple, which is that the American century is coming to an end. In many ways, the American century is over. And the US has been suffering this protracted decline in terms of its imperialist weight on the global arena. But now that decline is accelerating with a breathtaking speed. And it's been accompanied by the steady rise of primarily two new superpowers, China and Russia. That's basically the process that's unfolding right now. And we're watching it happen in real time. For the Western imperialists, the worst part of this story, beginning with the American ruling class, which is increasingly entering a period of panic, is that those superpowers are not only more closely aligned than ever before, those rival powers, they're consciously and energetically building a bloc against the declining West. The trade bloc, to begin with, in the form of BRICS and BRICS Plus, now has 11 member countries. There's 12 more countries that are seeking to join BRICS or are applying for partner country status. They're developing infrastructure financing through the BRICS Bank. They're talking about trade in local currencies instead of using the dollar. There's still plans for developing a BRICS currency. There's electronic payment initiatives. Brazil is heading this up. So there's all of these developments in place, but it's not just a trade bloc. Last weekend in Tianjin, more than 20 heads of state attended this Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That was formed in 2001, and initially it was Russia, China, and a handful of Central Asian countries. It's since been joined by more than a dozen more countries. But you saw also this military parade in Beijing, which the world is talking about. I mean, this was a display of the largest army in the world. They unveiled 76 different weapons. 47 of them were brand new weapons, very advanced ones too. All kinds of the nuclear arsenal, hypersonic missiles, robot wolves that come out of Black Mirror. And, you know, if you compare this to Trump's birthday parade, it makes you think that, like, the night before the big parade, the U.S. Army General Staff was probably telling the soldiers, you know, the main thing out there tomorrow is have fun. You know? It's your birthday. We're out there to have a good time. No matter what happens, put a smile on. And I think that's the way that the U.S. Army was marching. The impression that the Chinese military has given the world is a very different one. But the big headline from the SCO last weekend was this unprecedented unity, not just between China and Russia, which the West used to think was impossible. China, Russia, and India. That's the big headline. They're calling it the Troika, Xi, Putin, and Modi. And just a few words about the significance of India joining this. You know, India was part of BRICS, but it was kind of a half in, half out. You know, India had a policy which they called strategic autonomy. Basically means we're going to try and we're not going to pick sides. We're not going to go all in for one or the other. They were keeping their options open. There was also a long-standing assumption that China and India cannot get along. There's been problems between China and India since they had a war in 1962. There was a border dispute between India and China in a region in the Himalayas, and China gained control of a section of India that was roughly the size of Switzerland. It still controls it to this day, and that continues to be a disputed border. Along that border, there was military hostilities just 5 years ago. There was something like a couple dozen troops killed in 2020. And there's been huge military buildups on both sides of that border and economic and trade sanctions between those countries. So the U.S. looks at this and says, yeah, India's on our side because of this, because India is not going to get along with China. Most of the Indian ruling class has looked at the U.S. as the more favorable trading partner. And up until the last month, India was, in this balancing role, like the needle was turning towards India and the U.S. getting along. At the beginning of the year, Modi visited Trump in the White House. There have been all kinds of plans and negotiations and talks taking place. After Liberation Day, J.D. Vance made a special trip to India, talking about trying to strike a deal. In July, Trump said we're very close to a deal with India. And the war between India and Pakistan also made it seem like things were going in the direction of the U.S. as well. After all, China has a strategic partnership with Pakistan, was helping to arm Pakistan in that conflict, it seemed there's no way that India and China are going to get along. Last month, all of this was blown up by Trump. All of this has fallen apart. When the Trump administration decided to put a 50% tariff on India, they doubled the rate from 25 to 50%. India and Brazil are now at the top of the list. China's still being decided. But why did Trump do this? I mean, I think that this was a miscalculation and a massive blunder. There are some people that explain this as a 5D chess move, and there's all kinds of people that have different theories about it. But the Trump team decided to go from nice diplomacy with India to playing hardball for two reasons. One is that India was refusing to cave to all of Trump's demands in the negotiations. India has tariffs on the US. They were unwilling to drop them down to zero, like a lot of other countries were. So there's that policy. But the main one is that they decided to use this as a way to punish India for purchasing Russian energy. Now I found this graphic that helps you see, for those who can see it. At the top, this is the biggest wartime buyers of Russian fossil fuels since the war began. The top line is China. The second line is India. After that, you can see it drops off quite quickly. There's Turkey, EU, that's just a couple countries that aren't towing the line, like Hungary and Slovakia, Brazil, Singapore. But as you can see, China and India are the two that matter. If India stopped buying Russian oil, it really would hurt the Russian economy. And the US figured that this is the chance to split BRICS, basically at the heart of it, and to force India to pick a side. India bought $53 billion worth of Russian oil last year alone. They've been refining it and sending it to Europe. This is the way that Europe gets Russian energy, but it passes through Indian refinement as a middle ground. You know, what happened was it had the opposite of the intended effect. Russia and China are ramping up trade with India. And the symbolism of the Troika shows that Trump has actually pushed them all into the same corner. And increasingly, I mean, the remarkable thing is the degree to which Modi and Xi are putting aside their differences and saying, we're going to get along now. There's huge investments planned from Russia and China in India's economy. I mean, the three are really, it's becoming, here's how The Guardian talked about it. They stood together like old friends, heads thrown back in jovial laughter, clutching one another's hands affectionately. Except this was no ordinary gathering of three men, but a meeting of three of the most powerful non-Western leaders, Putin, Xi Jinping, and Modi. This was Modi's first visit to China in 7 years, and the hostilities that had come to define the country's relationship in recent years were nowhere to be seen. Meanwhile, China has observed the alienation of New Delhi and Washington with overt glee and has made it clear its priority now is a complete normalization of Indo-Chinese ties. Xi says it's vital to be friends, a good neighbor, the dragon, the elephant coming together, and they're going to stabilize their border. They're going to reopen their economies to each other. This means India is going to get access to Chinese rare earths, Chinese raw materials, which are going to be important. China is going to get access to a massive, massive consumer market, which China is in desperate need of, somewhere to move its commodities. Modi has shown other sides of going in for all in for BRICS as well. There's recently been meetings between Modi and Lula to discuss this the digital payment plan. And Brazil's in a similar situation with this 50% tariff on Brazil. It was meant to hurt, you know, one of these players that was kind of in the in-between. It's totally tipped in the direction of Russia and China. 20 years ago, a quarter of Brazil's exports went to the US. It was a big part of their economy. Now it's down to 1/7, and that share is going to continue to plummet. This big mega port in Chancay, one of the biggest in the world in Peru, the port of Chancay, allows Chinese shipping to reach Brazil 10 days faster than it used to by going through the Panama Canal. Remember, if you look at the map, Brazil's over here. It had to go through the Panama Canal. And going to Peru, basically, is a huge shortcut. And it's basically a big move to increase trade between China and Brazil. There's been all kinds of energy deals. Russia really wants China to continue to buy even more of its gas and its oil. And now the latest deal is they're talking about a second pipeline, a second gas pipeline, Siberian Pipeline 2, from China to Russia, which China has for a long time held off on. The Chinese have wanted to be, didn't want to rely too much on Russian energy. They wanted to keep some of their options open. This is Bloomberg's article last week. Russian energy partners are moving a bit closer. China's resisted Russia's overtures for years. Why? Because the economy is not growing at the pace that it was in the early 2000s. Beijing is wary of overdependence on one supplier. Still, Trump may have changed that calculation. Under pressure, a vital energy triangle may be getting a little tighter, and that calculation has changed. I mean, every step that Trump has made has brought the trade and the diplomatic and military links, infrastructure deals, all of this a lot closer. And it's not just a small club of countries, the way Trump, denigrated a couple months ago. He's talking about these little group of countries, the BRICS. By GDP, the top economies in the world are the US, China, Germany, and India is in fourth place. India is now the fastest major growing economy. The rate of growth in India has overtaken the Chinese rate of growth since the pandemic. It's been at over 6% annual GDP growth for the last 3 decades. And since 2021, it's been over 8%. Now, I don't know, reading about this, it made me realize that there's a lot that I don't know about the Indian economy. I'd like to learn some more about it. But one of the things I read is that there's this online service sector has had a huge part of its growth. Analysts have described it as having a unique path that's kind of skipped industrialization. It's gone from an agricultural country to like an advanced service based country. That doesn't mean that everything is fine in the Indian economy. But if China was the workshop of the world in terms of manufacturing in the early 2000s, India has kind of found its own niche as the call center, the service support of the world. And the IMF said a quarter of its workers are in highly AI-exposed jobs, meaning that in the coming years, the developments with automation and AI could have really devastating effects on millions of workers in India. But in any case, we're talking about major economies. The fourth, at least if you measure it by GDP. Brazil and Russia are in 10th and 11th place by that measure, ahead of Spain and South Korea. But if you look at it by purchasing power parity, right, not just the dollar value, but the amount of things being produced and what's being bought, it's a different picture. Number one is China. China is now 33% larger than the United States. It's like 40 trillion by purchasing power. The US is next with around 30 trillion. India is in third place, and Russia is in fourth place, ahead of Germany, ahead of Japan. Brazil is in 8th place, ahead of France and the UK. And if you combine the economies of China, India, and Russia by purchasing power, that's 65.5 trillion. That's more than double the US economy. Combining the BRICS economies is around half of the world economy. If you look at just those 3 countries, China, India, and Russia, that's 3 billion people. That's like 38% of the global population. The US has at the present 4.2%. As JP pointed out in the Colossus book, you look at the banking assets. The top banks are now Chinese. The 4 top banks in the world are Chinese. The 5th is Japanese. In the mid-2000s, they were European. And the total combined holdings of Chinese banks, 58.5 trillion, more than double American banks. So even in these areas about the power of finance, there are some measures by which the US doesn't dominate in the way that it used to. Now, we're familiar with a lot of these statistics that show the various fields where China's pulled ahead of the US. But I think we should keep in mind when we're looking at this, like this new global balance of forces, that again, there's a simple story that we're telling with these figures. And it has to do with, the development of the productive forces, actually. On a global scale, capitalism has exhausted its potential to move humanity forward. But that doesn't mean that you can't have pockets of development, or that stagnation isn't one homogeneous picture. You can still have areas where there's unevenness. And primarily what we see is stagnation in the part of the world, in the West, the part of the world that used to dominate global capitalism. Another thing to point out is that growth rates and annual growth in GDP doesn't mean that revolution or class struggle are ruled out by any measure. Indonesia has had a 5% annual GDP growth rate for a decade, far higher than anything in the West, and yet poverty has also grown since 2018 by 38%. The fact that you have most of these symptoms of stagnation and the decline happening in the Western world, starting with the U.S., but also, the U.S. is kind of the linchpin of what was the Western world, has huge implications for the radicalization that is our layer, that's producing our layer, this millions of people that are drawing conclusions. But another way to kind of look at this sort of Western world, which feels like kind of a vague or fuzzy term, is the OECD countries, right? These are the countries that are generally, there's 38 of them, They're regarded as like the high-income countries, the really developed countries. The OECD was a successor to the countries that received Marshall aid in Europe. Originally, it was in 1948. It was the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, and then since then, it's expanded to include basically any other high-income country that's developed, along with the rules of U.S. imperialism. So it became the OECD in 1961 as countries that were committed to democracy and to market economies. But I was looking at the growth rates. This is the GDP growth, annual growth for the OECD members. Now you can see there was two catastrophic dips here. The second one kind of distorted the line because it was a big upswing post-pandemic. But the direction of the line, I hope, is pretty clear, that it's one where the growth rates in the 1960s were above 5%. Throughout the 60s, the average growth rate was 5.3% for the OECD countries. In the 70s, 3.6%. In the 80s, it dipped below 3%. It was 2.97%. In the 90s, 2.6%. I mean, continually, the average was falling. And since the 2000, the last 25 years, it's been 1.8% average growth rate. The last 5 years, 1.7. I mean, it's really quite a linear decline in terms of the economy. Now, there is something else behind this. It's not just like the rate of growth. What gave capitalism its justification was the development of the productive forces, right? The exploiters are extracting surplus value from the working class, but they're taking a portion of it and plowing it back into production. That's what justified capitalism. That's what creates the improvement in machinery, productivity, efficiency, the global market through global division of labor. Today, you can track this with gross capital formation. This is sounds like kind of a technical term, but here's exactly what gross fixed capital formation means. It measures the total value of investments in fixed assets, machinery, buildings, and equipment that are used in the production of goods and services for more than 1 year. It indicates how much new value is being invested in the economy's future productive capacity. So it's actually a pretty accurate measure of precisely what we're talking about. Are the countries investing in the means of production? Well, here's the gross fixed capital formation of the OECD countries. This is since 1970. The last one was as well. But as you can see, a very clear downward trend. The share of the economy that's being invested back into developing, investment in production, creating jobs, creating more efficiency, has been in a steady decline for more than 50 years. Here's gross fixed capital formation in China. You can see it's almost a mirror opposite. I mean, it's a remarkable uptick. And for the last period, for the last 15 years, it's averaged 42% of their GDP. Think of that. More than 4 out of $10 that the economy, 4 out of 10 RMB that the economy is generating is being plowed back into massive. It's a massive investment in production, in developing high technology, research, technique, building new plants, and so on. This is the gross fixed capital formation of China versus the OECD. You see this little pathetic line down here and this mountain up here. And for the US, it's basically the same shape. This is the US gross capital formation in China. So this is the basic, I'm pointing out all these technical charts and processes because I think this is the basic story that we should keep in mind when we're talking about the balance of forces, the balance of power in the US. These are really broad strokes, but the basic thing is that for the vast majority of the capitalist world, these are the symptoms of capitalism's exhaustion. It's not developing the productive forces. And then you have these pockets where you have massive investment taking place, and we'll talk about the reasons for that. But this also means that the US is facing a rivalry that it's never, on a scale that it has never faced before. You think about the rivalry that characterized the last century between the US and the Soviet Union. By purchasing power parity, at its peak, the Soviet Union reached 60% of the size of the US economy. That's the highest it ever got. And with that was the existential rivalry that gripped the U.S. ruling class and the Red Scare and their mortal threat. I mean, this was the whole fear behind the Cold War was there's this power that could challenge us. That was because they had reached a point of 60%. The Chinese economy has grown to 130% of what the U.S. is. It's already been surpassed. In the last 5 years, China produced 12 times as much steel, 3 times as many cars as the U.S., twice as much electricity. This has never happened. The U.S. has never been surpassed like this industrially or economically before, and that's why this is such a historic turning point. And for the ruling class, it really is an existential, I mean, the degree of panic and what the implications that are now kind of sinking in for the West are an existential threat. And they have, at this moment when they're under this huge shakeup for the world order, who's in the control room? They have a crisis of leadership, that it's Donald Trump who's manning the ship, and he's the one who's going to decide that we're going to take the world on a very different. He's not only manning the ship, but he comes in on day one, he's like, whoa, start turning onto a very different course, and everything is at the mercy of Donald Trump's decisions on how he's going to blow up the 80-year post-war liberal world order. I was thinking recently about what would it be like if Biden was still in power, or if we had Kamala in the White House dealing with all these things. And part of me was like, well, we will never know how they would. But in a way, we do know, because a year ago they were doing it. I mean, a year ago, it's not like you had a massive shift in the reality a year ago. It's just that it's finally being acknowledged. Trump was the one that stepped forward and said, this is the new reality, and we got to respond to it. The old ruling class was in complete denial. I mean, the dominant wing, the liberal wing of the ruling class, which is why they launched this war with Ukraine, with Russia, for example, why they took this opportunity to try and weaken one of their rivals. The Democrats are at an all-time low, in their polling. The Wall Street Journal published a few weeks ago a poll finding that it was at a 35-year low, basically since their polling record, they started tracking it. But it's not because of just the party got too woke. And it's not just because of how uncharismatic Kamala and Biden were, or how badly they campaigned or anything like this. We have to understand that the fate that the Democratic Party has suffered is part of a global phenomenon that's throughout the West. All of these OECD countries, where you have this picture of Western decline, are all having the same. This picture of decline is like also a picture of decline for the status quo, for the ruling institutions, for all the parties that governed in a very stable way. Think about how many of these countries had two-party systems. I started just looking, just off the top of my head, from a few of the UK, it was Tories and Labour for a long time. Your turn, then my turn, then your turn, kick them out, then the others come in. In Spain, it was the PSOE and the PP on the right. In Germany, the SPD and the CDU. In France, it was the Republicans and the Socialist Party. All of these, one after another, they all had a very stable arrangement, and they all entered into crisis roughly around the same time. When Trump and Sanders emerged on the scene in 2016, roughly that was the period where you had a disruption of all these two-party stable arrangements everywhere. I would say in the U.S. you had the same thing. It just didn't lead to the creation at this point of a new party, except if you want to, in a sense, the Republican Party pre-Trump and the Republican Party, it did kind of lead to the creation of a new party within the form of the old, and the Democrats are in a total existential crisis of their own. So you've had this disruption everywhere. The common feature of all of these countries is that, there's this generalized hatred towards all the parties that ruled for a long time, and the only force that's capitalizing it is on the right. It's the right-wing populists. There was an article on Marxist.com recently about Japan having its own version of this, the Sanseito is a right-wing populist party. Their slogan is, there's no party worth voting for, so we're going to build one from scratch. Not a bad slogan. And they had just 2.8 thousand members in 2020. Now they just got 9 million votes in the upper house in Japan. One of their other slogans is Japan First. They're capitalizing on discontent, on anger against immigrants in Japan. And their base is basically youth and young men. I mean, this is a very similar situation all throughout, and this is one of the OECD countries. This means that the establishment is on the defensive all throughout the West. And it's just like with the Democrats, and Trump calls them the deep state, but the average human material that filled the federal bureaucracy was on this side, was born of this kind of outlook. You can call them the neocons. When Trump came around, they looked at him like a threatening foreign object that wasn't that was out of his element, that didn't belong, and they tried everything to do to paralyze him and to stop him. I mean, this Russiagate thing, if anyone listens to The Daily, there's some episodes of The Daily that of the New York Times podcast that are just insufferable, but this Russiagate one was like they were treating, I mean, I can't even find the words to, they were treating it like Trump is just coming up with this baseless hoax that the Russian collusion in the 2016 election wasn't real. And now Trump's using this, he's weaponizing this to go against Obama officials. It was not real. What did Russia do in 2016? Having chatbots, as J.D. Vance said at the Munich Security Conference, having some chatbots and social media posts, if that's what brings down your election, what does that tell you about the strength of your democracy? That's what Russia did in 2016, like chatbots and comments on social media. Is that what made the Democrats so unpopular? Is that what tanked Hillary Clinton's chances in 2016? And yet, the CIA, FBI officials all came together and said, yes, we found very concerning evidence that Russia has helped Donald Trump to win this election. I mean, this whole thing was a manufactured hoax. On this, we can side with Trump's complaints against Russiagate, I think. So when you say that there's a civil war in the federal government, keep in mind who started this civil war. It was the establishment that took the first shots. And they're trying to do this all throughout Europe as well. I mean, sometimes they're just outright overturning elections, as in the case of Romania. In France, they managed to do to Le Pen what they hoped they were going to be able to do with the Trump impeachments. They get her on a technicality, and now she's barred from running. But none of these moves have done anything to stabilize, to bring back stability for them. None of them have helped improve the appeal of the status quo of all these hated parties. And so in each of these countries, in Germany, the AfD is the most popular party now. The rally in France is still leading the polls. Farage, Reform UK, is still leading. In each of these parties, this is the one force that is tapping systematically into that discontent. I would say also that the troubles facing the European ruling class have really only started. I mean, you're seeing like a sense of panic in the European ruling class in particular, but the debt level of the OECD countries has skyrocketed. The average debt to GDP is around 111%. Interest payments in France are the single biggest expense in the French budget. Bayrou, I hope comrades are watching what's happening in France. This Prime Minister Bayrou, the president, is about to fall. Is scheduled to fall on Monday, and the language coming out of the French labor movement is incredibly militant. I mean, they're basically quoting Lenin, saying the ruling class can't rule like before, and the working class can't tolerate their conditions like they did before. And this is an era of class war. Let's occupy the factories. This is not us saying this. This is the Unité CGT. This is like the left wing of but this is a massive force. But these are the conditions, this is the mood among the French working class. French ministers have said openly, 2 different French finance ministers have said that France is going to need an IMF bailout. You have high-profile UK economists saying the same thing about Britain, about the British debt. The IMF has $1 trillion in lending capacity. Just to put it into perspective, British debt is 3.8 trillion. French debt is 3.1 trillion. When they bailed out Greece 10 years ago, that was $37 billion. I mean, we're talking about a level of insolvency that is totally different. And so to have Western European countries, OECD countries, moving into a Sri Lanka-style predicament where they cannot pay their bills, but they're also not going to be able to continue governing and operating, because to move forward, I mean, they cannot make a right step. The Economist published an article last week, Fear the Deficit Populism Doom Loop. This is how they're kind of trying to get sympathy from the reader. Listen, you're a finance minister. Put yourself... I had to take a government class in high school, and they gave us like pretty much this exact scenario. You're a finance minister after a decade of meager economic growth, shocks from a financial crisis, a pandemic, and sky-high energy prices. Public debt is worth more than your country's GDP. Interest rates are at their highest in years, and merely servicing outstanding debt is taking up an ever greater share of tax revenue. Inflation is stubborn. America is satisfying much of the world's appetite for government bonds, meaning your debt must pay more to attract investors. You lie awake, worrying about how to make the numbers add up. Your fellow ministers, meanwhile, fret for their careers. Populist parties are on the rampage. The economic context calls for fiscal consolidation. The political one warns against austerity. What do you do? Give me a 50-word answer. But the article ends by pointing out that the populists are the ones, they're talking about the deficit populism doom loop. They're saying, we found this curious correlation between an increase in austerity and the rising appeal of populism. But that doesn't mean that the populists are going to have it easy either. They say the populist bind is a tight one. This is how the article ends. Pity the finance minister hoping to keep debt burdens under control and the hard right at bay. At least during his sleepless nights, he can console himself that when he is booted from office, his populist successor will face many of the same constraints. See how they like it. And that is true. I mean, once you have this force in the wings that can benefit, and they're skillfully doing everything they can to use this, all of this discontent or all this incompetent bungling from the establishment parties, everything the establishment does to try and hold them off is only helping them. But once you have these forces start to get into the control room in country after country, they're going to completely expose themselves because they have no solutions for any of this. Europe's underlying predicament is it is no longer in the U.S. interest to underwrite Europe. It's no longer a strategic priority for the U.S. That's the basic reality that's changed from the post-war era to the present. The U.S. needs to pivot away. And the ruling class is like coming to terms with this, and it's like they can't really accept it. I mean, it seems like they're going crazy. Sometimes it looks like an irrational denial of this new reality. If you look at the way that they've treated the war in Ukraine, they're talking about, this war-type hysteria about Russia is about to invade Denmark, and Russia is about to invade Sweden, and Russia's plotting to march into Berlin, and this is the future. The Russians are coming for us, and Putin will never be stopped until we all unite against him. This is the way that they're talking. But at the World Congress, this point was made. This propaganda may be insane, and it's true. It's a lie. They're lying to the working class of Europe, saying Putin is coming for you. Putin's coming for all of us. Putin's going to invade Europe. But the European ruling class does have its reasons to fear Russia. Their imperialist interests really are under threat. In Central Europe and Eastern Europe, there's a question of which pole will have a greater gravitational pull on an entire section. I mean, Europe will be fragmented because it'll make sense for a lot of these smaller countries in the middle of Europe to say, look, we have to trade more with the most stable power here. But it's more than that. It's also in the Baltic. This is the Baltic after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is like Lithuania, Ethiopia, Estonia, sorry, some far-flung little countries After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Swedish banks went in and dominated those areas. This became part of they basically carved up all the former spheres of influence of the Soviet Union. They now risk losing that again. And then you have the Arctic. I mean, that's a big, in the Arctic, there are some predictions that the Arctic is going to be ice-free somewhere in between 2050 or within the next 10 years by some predictions, which is incredible. And never mind the catastrophic rise in sea levels and what that's going to mean. This is opening up markets. Rare earths are going to be available. You can have fishing areas, oil and gas deposits. But above all, it's the shipping lanes. The maritime route that connects Europe to Asia right now goes to the Suez Canal. Once it's open in the Arctic, it's going to cut that down by 50%. And so all of European countries are looking at this, and the Arctic has for a long time been something that they've been interested in. Now, Russia dominates the Arctic. This is completely a sphere of influence of Russia. More than half of Arctic territory is Russian. More than half of the Arctic population is Russian. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Russia was on its knees, all of these other small Arctic states said, let's have a second look at the Arctic, and they formed the Arctic Council. Now, this is any country that has any part of its territory above the Arctic line. Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, the United States, and Russia was a part of this. Since then, they've opened it up. If anyone else wants to join Club Arctic, we're going to have, there's observer country status, and you can get in on this. So Germany joins Italy, France, the Netherlands, Poland, Singapore, China joins India, South Korea, Spain, Japan, Switzerland, the UK. Everyone wants to join Club Arctic. Now, when the Russia-Ukraine war started in 2022, they decided we're going to kick Russia out of the Arctic Council. They essentially tried to, the Arctic states said, we're going to boycott all future meetings of this, except we're going to form a new council. It's not going to include Russia. And so while they're playing all these games, I mean, Russia has complete military dominance in the Arctic. It's been opening up dozens of Soviet-era military bases. It dominates the shipping lanes. It's natural gas. There's a lot of, the pipelines start in the Arctic. And so, you know, the small European groups are kind of looking to band together and try and hold the Russians at bay. This recent NATO meeting that Trump convinced the Europeans that the US is going to close the taps. We're not going to keep arming Ukraine directly. But if you want to arm Ukraine, you can buy weapons from the US and you can send them to Ukraine. This is what the Europeans were forced to accept. And that's begun now. In the last week, you had the first installment of these weapons purchases. Denmark, Netherlands, and Norway scraped together $825 million and purchased 3,500 extended range cruise missiles to give to Ukraine. It's not going to make any difference in the case of the Ukraine war, but now you have these small countries that are basically footing this bill, sending these money and resources into a black hole at the hopes of holding the Russians, keeping them back and keeping the war going above all. You know, they want to keep the US involved. But when you look at it from this perspective, here's the other thing that, look, the French imperialists have lost their connection to the African former colonies, which they dominated up until now. Since 2022, the French have been kicked out. They had troops in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, Senegal, and Ivory Coast. They've been kicked out of all of those countries, and the Russians have come in. Russians are arming those countries. They're trading with them. They're giving them wheat. Russians are getting control of mines in those countries. So Russia is, to this extent, you can see, this is how the European imperialists look at Russia as an existential threat. It's a threat to their imperialist interests, not a threat to the working class of Europe. It's a threat to all of these extra sources, these streams of income in imperialist markets that are now becoming spheres of influence of the other rival bloc. So it makes more sense why Macron, follows Zelensky around like this behind his every step, and why they're having, Macron is the big champion of holding Zelensky's arm in the air. We're going to be here for you. And the Europeans, they're doubling down. Always, they had this coalition, this meeting of the willing, the coalition of the willing on Saturday, while the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was meeting. We're going to have our own international meeting. We're going to have 30 countries together, all these little tiny European countries, I think what was the statement that they came up with this plan, a reassurance force. That's the new. And it made me picture like they're at the end, can we all form a line, and then Zelensky would walk down the line, everyone gives them a pat on the back and gives us some reassuring comments. That's the reassurance force. That's all that Europe has to offer Ukraine. They have no weapon. I mean, the whole point of the Ukraine war as a war of attrition is that it has exposed this reality that one side has an industrial military base, it's powerful, it's able to sustain itself and expand, and has expanded in the course of the war, and the other side is basically broke. Has very limited reserves, has one force that is able to supply arms, and that's the United States. Pull the US out, which is what Trump is doing, and Europe has nothing left to fight with. That's the reality on the ground. They're talking about, we're going to have, any day now, the pending discussion is the US is going to provide a security backstop. Macron says, that's one of our decisions. We're all really excited. This security backstop's going to come any day now. It's not going to come because the United States is pivoting away. I've been reading some articles also that are trying to argue that the U.S. is making a mistake by pivoting away from Europe. One of them was from the Atlantic Council. The headline is Russia or China the greater threat to the U.S.? This says there's a clear answer, and they argue that Russia is the greater threat because it has the most nuclear warheads of any country in the world. It has 5,500 compared to just over 5,000 that the U.S. has. China has 600. They also make the point, and these are true, that Russia has real combat experience. Russia has had troops on the ground. They've been fighting global conflicts. China hasn't had a ground war in many decades, not a serious one. But beyond this, the main argument they're making is that Europe should still matter to the U.S. economically. The trade, the volume of trade between the U.S. and the EU, the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world, more than 40% of global GDP. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has called it, said there's no two other regions in the world that are as deeply integrated as the U.S. and Europe. All of that is true, but it kind of misses the point because Trump is not trying to cut off the U.S. from Europe. What Trump is trying to do is demote Europe from the status of a partner to the status of a subordinate vassal that can be squeezed, that can be made to suffer the pain, that can be a pain sponge for the economic problems that are facing the West. He's taking his allies saying, you're going to go first, into the chaos. You have, this debt problem is really serious. You're going to suffer it first. Oh, you have to implement austerity. Europe's going to do it first. That's what Trump is doing. That's what he's trying to do to all of the former allies of the U.S. There was another piece that was in The Atlantic by Nick Clegg. This is the former UK Deputy Prime Minister in the 2010s. And he wrote this essay about the wonders of transatlanticism, which read like a heartbroken letter, like saying, let's not break up. We can work out our differences, but it's going to be too painful if we actually break up. And he says, he gives kind of his credentials. I used to work as an EU trade negotiator for the European Parliament. I was part of an effort working with various U.S. administrations to build a rules-based global trading system. As Britain's Deputy Prime Minister, I worked with the Obama administration on an array of shared endeavors, including counter-terrorist operations and commercial agreements. It's like, can we just go back to the time when we were invading Iraq together and we were getting along? Everything was, it was a happier time. He says, in short, a world in which Europe and America don't walk tall and in tandem with each other, even when they disagree, is hard for me to contemplate. An interesting point that he brings up is that at this time, just 15 years ago, the GDPs of Europe and the United States were basically 1-to-1. Now, the U.S. is 1.5 times larger. He makes the point that what's pulling this relationship apart, ironically, is the demonstrable nature of America's supremacy over Europe. Now, what's the basis of this supremacy? This is an open trading system built on the undisputed role of the dollar as the global reserve currency. That's getting shaky now. Investors are not so confident in the stability of the U.S. dominating the financial currency system. The deployment of overwhelming defense and security capabilities, that plug is being pulled. The gravitational pull of a world-leading university system isn't doing so great right now. Trump is attacking it, freezing its funds, but also people are coming out with degrees and huge debt and nothing to do with it. I mean, the U.S. universities are in decline. Economic prowess built on American domination of both international finance and technology. The U.S. on all of these benchmarks has comprehensively pulled ahead of Europe. That may be true from Europe's perspective, but the U.S. is on the retreat from all of these things in terms of pillars of its own power. The last point, he says, the frictions and disagreements between Europe and America have always been there, but the divisions seem starker now. They're increasingly framed in zero-sum terms. And when I read that, I've been thinking, I've been seeing this phrase about zero-sum. There was the Financial Times had this response, Zoran Mamdani is wrong. Billionaires should exist. He said, of course, billionaires should exist. The Democratic Socialist candidate to be mayor of New York seems to think that the economy is a zero-sum game, where if you do better, it must mean that I do worse. This is profoundly mistaken. While amassing their fortunes, billionaires make the rest of us richer, not poorer. But this zero-sum, there was another thing in the Economist, this is the headline, to understand America today, study the zero-sum mindset. Let me just read this at the beginning of it. It says, look at the news or social media these days, and you might see a pattern. Stories are about groups in conflict, competing for limited resources, with the gains for some framed as losses for others. More and more, debates are shaped by a mindset that sees the world as a fixed pie, where one group's gain is another's loss. It goes on to say, we need to look at where this mentality comes from. It doesn't just come from nowhere. This is the article continues, people who have done better than their parents and experience upward mobility are less likely to think in zero-sum terms. This also explains why younger generations in America are more zero-sum. They've grown up during times of slower economic growth and lower mobility. Other rich countries exhibit a similar generational pattern. This is the OECD. It calls it, at the end of it, the article saying, politicians need to look at this. We should have some more win-win policies, It's funny that the other Economist article is saying, put yourself in the position of a finance minister. There's nothing you can do. And this one's saying, And this one's saying, maybe we should just do more win-win, so everyone can do better. But to me, this kind of gets to the heart of what we're saying with our perspectives, actually. I mean, the world is a fixed pie. Globalization is over. And that's what that means. You don't have the expansion of markets anymore. And all of these new technologies, the new industries that are arising, that's competition for a very small number of powers in the world. But when the volume of trade was expanding in the post-war, you had new industries, new markets, new territories to incorporate into the global market, new populations that were coming into it after the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? Restoration of capitalism in China. There was that gave it expanse. And when you have expansion, that's when that mechanism of capitalism basically creates an environment. It's like the capitalist will say, tomorrow the market's going to be bigger than it is today. So it makes sense to invest in the future. That's no longer the horizon that they see. So they're not going to invest. They have nothing to kind of look forward to, which is why they're pouring it all into stock buybacks, and they're basically just parasitically just absorbing that in their own bank accounts. The size of the investment that you need for the cutting edge industries, if you look at the past, steam power was very important at one time for international balance of power. Railroads, steel, coal, right? In the 20th century was oil, the auto industry, and then who has the oil becomes the big question. Now the global scramble is for AI. You need massive computing power to do that. You need like data centers, and you need microchips, superconductors. On top of this, you have renewable energies and rare earths. This is the imperialist scramble of our time. But the amount of investment that you need, the amount of capital to even participate in the game is so great that the European Marxists are formed can be approached from many different angles. On an individual level, it's a question that we all ask ourselves. How do I become a Marxist? What do I need to do? What are the habits that are going to be required of me? What does it mean to be a Marxist? At what point do I go from wanting to be a Marxist to being a Marxist? It's a process. So what does that process look like? What kind of effort is required? There's also a collective way of thinking about it. It's not just an individual thing. Look at what's happening in the British section. Hundreds of people coming into the organization saying, I'm a communist, I want to fight for revolution. There's a social side of saying, what is it going to take those people off the street? They scan a sticker, they come into the organization. How do you make Marxists out of them? What kind of structure is required? What kind of meetings? What kind of branch meetings? What kind of reading groups and one-on-ones? What is it going to take as an organization to produce Marxists? That's another side of it. And then there's another angle to this, a different way of approaching it. Over there, Marxism on the rise. That's our banner from last Congress in 2021. And we were talking about a shift in the political landscape. There's something happening. There's a shift in the mood. What does it mean for Marxism to become an influential point of reference in the United States? For people to say, well, what is the Marxist position, and know what they're talking about? That's another way of saying, how are Marxists formed? It's not, Marxism on the rise means the rise of a new influence, the rise of a new body of ideas that's part of a public debate that's taking place. As you can see, there's different ways of approaching it. There's also the question of what does it mean to be a Marxist? How did Marxism itself come about? And so we'll try to cover some of these different angles. I think Hegel's quote sums it up nicely, though. If you stop and think about it, you realize there's a lot more to it. What is well known and familiar is not really understood precisely because it's well known and familiar. A lot of times you assume, okay, I got that down, I'm ready to move on to the next thing, and you realize there was a little bit more to that first step before moving on, before you can make that progress. Hegel wrote a lot about this kind of stuff, the process of cognition, what it means to learn something, the process of becoming aware of something that you're not aware of before. It's sometimes a surprising process. It's a paradoxical process, because at first you can't know what you don't know. You become aware of it after you realize, oh, I hadn't quite understood that yet, and now I get it. There's a lot about Marxism that's like that, and the power of dialectics is the ability to perceive and realize that there's more than meets the eye. There's form and there's content. There's the surface appearance, and then there's something happening under the surface. I think these questions are really fascinating, but it's not just food for thought. It's not just interesting questions that we're asking here. It's really urgent questions from a political standpoint. We've been talking this weekend about building the forces of a revolutionary organization that can become the banner of attraction for that radicalizing layer. The theme of this Congress, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. I think that's one of those quotes that fits what we're talking about. One of those things that we can often repeat without really digesting how much there is to this sentence right here and what's behind it. I want to start by pointing out something, an observation that Trotsky made that was kind of a surprising one. He says, one makes the revolution with relatively few Marxists, even within the party. He says, here are the collective substitutes for what the individual cannot achieve. In 1917, you could say, in terms of Marxist theoreticians in the Bolsheviks, after all those years of preparation, Lenin and Trotsky were like the masters of Marxism. They understood. You had a lot of people that were like semi-Marxists, passive Marxists, partial Marxists, working under the supervision of Lenin and Trotsky. But, he says that the individual can hardly master each separate area. It's necessary to have experts who can specialize in a certain area of theory, a certain political issue, but then they supplement one another. Collectively, the organization is greater than the sum of its parts. That's part of this question. We don't all, we don't reach the absolute truth as individuals and then, oh, now I got it. I got Marxism. Now I've learned it. Collectively, it's something that emerges from a room full of Marxists, something that emerges from a discussion around a table full of Marxists, putting their Marxism together. Something emerges from that. He says it's not because Marxism is a secret science that it's so rare to find, thoroughly developed Marxist theoreticians. He says it's just very difficult to escape the colossal pressure of the bourgeois environment with all of its influences. And that's part of Marxism. Part of learning these ideas is acquiring a firm stance. It's acquiring a backbone ideologically against pressures. That's part of what Marxists have always defied official bourgeois public opinion. But being able to defy that is actually a difficult thing. Realizing that there's an onslaught, there's a torrent, there's a current. Sometimes most people follow the current, they're swept away with it without even recognizing that they're following a current. We know the idea that those who say, I don't have a philosophy, end up repeating thoughtlessly the philosophy that surrounds them. They repeat the prejudices and the main ideas of the ruling class. That's what surrounds us. Being a Marxist means we recognize the current. We can see it, and then being able to see it helps you take a stand against it, push in the opposite direction. That's part of the class struggle, that being able to have that counter pressure, again, that emerges collectively. Together, we are able to withstand that current, and we create a countervailing pressure against official bourgeois public opinion. But again, it's not something that happens just by the nature of joining a Marxist organization. And it's part of a learning process. At first, I can tell you that when I first joined, I would have considered myself a Marxist on the day that I joined. And I was very happy, very proud to be a card-carrying Marxist, a card-carrying communist. To me, that was the end of the journey. I had been through all kinds of naive, eclectic political ideas. I went through a phase of religious thinking growing up. I went through a phase of a utopian socialism, thinking maybe we can just form a little commune and we can all just work together and we're all just gonna work for the greater good and show people how happy we are, and then it's gonna spread, and and then we don't have to use any violence. And I came from that direction, and then having discussions, arriving at the idea, no, you have to overthrow capitalism. Making that, to me, that's like, okay, then I'm a Marxist. I've come to the ideas of Marxism. And if someone had asked me, I was 16 years old when I joined, very enthusiastic in my defense of Marxism. If someone had asked me, well, what makes you a Marxist? I wouldn't have thought, don't you see the hammer and sickle on my shirt? The back says Marxist.com. I'm a Marxist. It was as simple as that. And of course, I didn't realize that at the time I had very little idea of what Marxism really was. I knew what I was defending. I knew the banner I was defending. I liked the hammer and sickle. I knew where I stood on the political spectrum. But it takes time to learn Marxism. I couldn't have told you. I remember a couple years after joining the organization, attending my first Congress, hearing about dialectics and coming back thinking, there's something to that. I feel like I need to know what dialectics is in order to understand a lot of other things. And that's true. There is a process of learning, of gaining depth. One of the ways that we can sense our own political development is when we come back to a book that we've read. At the time, I read the manifesto, high school, loved it, understood 1 out of 10 words or 1 out of 10 lines or ideas, But that was enough. I was very happy with that 1/10 of the content. Trying to piece it together, getting little bits and morsels out of what I'm reading. You come back to it years later and it's like, wow, it's like reading it for the first time. And so much more jumps out of the page. That's where you started to sense. I wasn't aware of how much I was skipping over the first time I read it. I wasn't aware of it doesn't really register what that's saying, so you just kind of move on to the next thing. And then the next time you read it, you realize there's so much more. This is such a rich document. There's so much more to learn from that. I've had that experience many times. That's something that shows us our progress. Actually, the most recent experience like that was in my branch. Shout out to NYC1 comrades here. We had What is to be Done. By the end of the discussion, we read it chapter by chapter in branch. By the end of the discussion, I think all of our comrades were so enthusiastic about this book. The last discussion we had, the interventions were like, I love Lenin. Like, I am so thankful for Lenin, But we realized what a remarkably relevant book this is. What is to be done is like, if you understand the argument that's being made here, then you're prepared to build something like the Bolsheviks did. And if you don't understand it, then you're not quite prepared yet. It's actually, it depends on understanding Bolshevism. It's difficult though, and the first time I read it, I got little bits and pieces. I got a lot of great stuff out of it. This time, reading it together, reading it more deeply and following it more carefully, you can follow the line of argument. It's so powerful. One of the things we realized is it's difficult because Lenin always wrote for the time that he was in. He was polemicizing. He was having a battle to win influence, to educate the comrades within a moment, within a particular landscape in the Marxist movement and in the international socialist movement. If this was written, it wasn't written for an audience 120 years later. It was written for his audience then. If it were written for an audience 120 years later, it would have been written like this. It's the same book, comrades. Read this book. Ted Grant said, you get out of a book what you bring to it. We bring a lot of things, after you bring a lot more learning, a lot more of a sense of history, a lot more familiarity. You bring more of a foundation in materialism, in dialectics, a philosophical foundation. You also bring your own experience. We connect it, each time we read it, we connect it to what we're going through, what political polemics we're having on the left today, what discussions we're having with context. All of that you bring to it, and then comrades bring different angles to it. All of that helps us in the process of learning. And sometimes you make surprising connections from an unexpected thing. You read something that has nothing to do with the discussion you're having tomorrow, and you realize that makes me think of the leadoff we're about to discuss in branch tomorrow. I think one of the urgent angles of this whole discussion is precisely the Marxism on the rise. Because as we said, in the land of McCarthyism, the land of the Red Scare, despite all of their efforts, there are 39 million young people who view Marxism in a favorable light. Those 20% of youth who say communism's their ideal economic system. And it makes us understand that we're moving in a direction. There's a radicalization that's happening. It's a process. It's not a snapshot. We're moving in a direction. It's being driven by history, by historical forces. But we want to understand, where is this going? Is Marxism, what does it mean when we say Marxism is on the rise? You could say the favorability of Marxism is on the rise. A friendly attitude towards Marxism is on the rise. People are open to what you have to say, but is Marxism really on the rise yet? Are people studying Marxist ideas? Are 20% of young people reading the manifesto and what is to be done? There's more people reading now than ever, for sure. There's more people that are seeking out these ideas. But what's on the rise is more of the preliminary, it's the shift in the mood. There's an openness, there's a shifting mood. That's what's on the rise yet. If you had a poll that says, what is the public opinion in relation to a materialist view of history, or in relation to class independence, the polls would show that the vast majority of respondents have never heard of these mysterious concepts, because the vast majority of them have never interacted with the Marxist. A lot of times when we're selling the paper, we're tabling out there, you realize statistically speaking, you're the first time that person has ever interacted with a Marxist, someone who studied Marxist ideas and brings a Marxist perspective. In that sense, you're the molecular process of a new idea, a new influence a new force in the political landscape. But there have been times when that was happening, not just on a molecular process, on an explosive, dramatic process. That's something that we want to learn from. How Marxism sank roots in a vast country that had no Marxist tradition, no Marxist organizations, nobody who considered themselves a Marxist, and was able to take off on a level far beyond what we've seen so far. I'm talking about learning from this history right here, learning from how Marxism sank roots in Russia. Lenin, of course, you can compare it. We all know these headlines that says, when did everyone become a socialist? And it's like, the youth are going to socialism, and it's like there's this frenzy that's moving in this direction. Compare it to the way Lenin described the turn of the 20th century. It's not just when did people become socialists, it was the rise of Marxism. He says, Marxist books were published one after another. Marxist journals and newspapers were founded. Nearly everyone became a Marxist. Marxists were flattered. Marxists were courted. The book publishers rejoiced at the extraordinary ready sale of Marxist literature, i.e., it was the rise of Marxist ideas, Marxist reading material, Marxist arguments. It was the ideas, the philosophy, the influence of a new ideology was making its way into the political landscape. That's not the case yet. A mood is making its way into the political landscape. It's up to us to bring the ideas, to bring that to the next level. Trotsky described here, there's a clip from the 1890s from the Caucasus, a liberal newspaper that was talking about the rise of Marxism. Here's how he says that, Trotsky says, they reported it more with surprise rather than hostility. It was like this new alien, unique thing. He says, since 1893, this is the newspaper, young men representing a singular trend and advocating a unique program have been contributing to the local publications. They are supporters of the theory of economic materialism. Right now, we don't see headlines that say, economic materialism is on the rise, or dialectical thinking is on the rise, or advocates of a new materialist conception of history. That's not, it's at the very beginning so far, but that was storming the landscape. And if you think that at the beginning of the 1880s, it was starting from scratch, zero, end of the following decade, end of the 1890s, everyone was a Marxist. How did that transition take place? It wasn't just the political climate. It wasn't just the objective situation. It's what those Marxists did. They carried those ideas into the political landscape, and they did it with the depth of Marxism. The thing that you can say, going back to the Emancipation of Labor group, the group around Plekhanov and 5 other people, a tiny group with zero visibility, no influence, a tiny voice in the wilderness, they achieved what appeared to be a miracle at the time. They seemed to have no audience, no one really paying attention to what they're writing, but the things that they were writing presented the depth of Marxism, its philosophy. They explained how Marxism emerged from the thread of the evolution of the history of philosophy out of the Enlightenment. They explained the history of materialism giving rise to Marxism. And most people weren't ready to read stuff like that and follow what that argument was about. But those who did, they would read it and they would realize that Marxism is the culmination of the evolution of human thought to its highest point. If you realize that and you recognize it, that's a pretty special thing. Marxism is the highest level of thinking that humanity has produced yet. If you recognize that, then you have something in your hands you got to do something with. It's powerful. It's an eye-opening experience. That's what allowed Marxism to sink roots. If the Emancipation of Labor group had tried to just win as big of an audience as possible, just water it down, just give people the ABCs of socialism, like what DSA puts out, or Bhaskar Sankara's ABCs of socialism, maybe they would have sold more books from the beginning. They would never have sunk roots in that country, because you would not have ignited the kind of passion that it took for people to say, I am a Marxist now. I'm going to dedicate my life to spreading these ideas. By sinking roots, that's the taproot, that's the depth, the anchor. By sinking that kind of depth, helping people understand Marxism from a philosophical standpoint, they were able to spread something, to sprout an army of dedicated Marxists that were making it their mission to carry this into the landscape. Lenin and Trotsky said, Plekhanov educated an entire generation of revolutionaries. That was the foundation. He provided that initial pioneering role. Now, was that enough? It wasn't. Plekhanov lost his bearings later on. It's not enough just to have a foundation in theory and philosophy. You need that, but then you need something beyond that. You went from Plekhanov to Lenin. Lenin took the same approach. We need the insistence on theory. In fact, they both share this. In fact, Lenin took this from Plekhanov. This idea, you need to have that foundation, but Lenin took it to its next level. You take these ideas and then you build something unbreakable with them. You take the ideas and it's not just a foundation. You're going to build something unyielding. On the basis of the ideas, you build an organization of people who understand them, of people who translate that into discipline, into revolutionary will, into commitment, an organization that can transform society. The second part of this, the revolutionary movement, it's not just people who are out on the streets with banners. What does it mean to build a revolutionary movement? It means a force in society that is capable of overthrowing capitalism, a force that is capable of going up against the ultimate resistance of this ruling class and overcoming it, coming the other side. If you want to have that, you need theory for that. You need cohesion. You need an ideology that's shared. You need political homogeneity. That's what Lenin understood better than anybody else. The history of Bolshevism is a history of forging that organization of people who had a shared perspective. They saw the world through the same eyes. Marxism was their collective compass, and that's what gave them the power. You read all these the police reports of Tsarism, looking at the progress of Bolshevism, and they were like freaking out about how they're far better organized than anybody else. They have a much stronger will. They're more effective. They're actually sinking roots everywhere. And what was the secret to all of that success? Theory. It was philosophy. It was those books over there. That was the secret. That's the thing that gave them that special ingredient, the iron discipline, to become a force. And that's why Lenin's attitude towards all opportunities for clarification, all debates, Lenin always described, looking back, he described the process of Bolshevism as this process of polemics, of ideological battles with different currents that were all meant at sharpening a particular line, creating a demarcation, a delineation. Left-wing Communism, another great book, in one of our we have over there. There's a chapter. I don't even have to quote from the chapter. I'm just going to tell you what the chapter is called. It says it all, very descriptive. Chapter 4, the struggle against enemies within the working class movement, which helped Bolshevism develop, gain strength, and become steel. It's a great chapter. You should read it. You should read it as well. But just knowing the title, that's the way that Lenin saw it. In fact, that was the process. They became steeled because of each polemic, and that's why people from the outside were critiquing them. Actually, some of the members of the Emancipation of Labor group themselves didn't understand the importance of this kind of sharp, fierce polemics. By the way, this is a fierce polemic. You read it. He grips onto his enemies. He doesn't let go. There was a member of the Emancipation of Labor, Vera Zasulich, who was more of her temperament was more, let's all get along. Do we really need to have this kind of like a vicious approach? She told Lenin one time, this is, Trotsky recollects this, she told Lenin one time, Plekhanov, he's a greyhound. He shakes his enemies and then he lets them go. But you're a bulldog. She says, you have a deadly bite. And in the anecdote, Sulich tells Trotsky, and then Lenin repeated that. Oh, a deadly bite? He liked it. He had that bold, if you read this, you can see the method of a bulldog here. But it was not gratuitous. He wasn't just doing it to attack his enemies. He was doing it to transmit ideas to his followers, to the Marxists, to help people understand this is where the line is. You have to, and that sharpness, that line, is what created the power of that ideological cohesion among the Bolsheviks. In fact, in a general sense, this applies not just to a proletarian revolution. The bourgeois revolution was also preceded by a storming. Right? The storming of the Bastille was preceded by a storming of the philosophy that gave it all of its authority. A 300-year process of preparing the ground ideologically for the rise of the bourgeoisie. Marx and Engels definitely understood that. So, again, that's this is there's a lot more depth in this one sentence than we often stop to think about. I want to talk about how Marxism itself was born. It would obviously be a whole other session of Marxism itself, but just a brief account because I think it's an awesome story and an awesome achievement. by two young geniuses. And we often talk about leaps forward in human understanding are achieved by standing on the shoulders of giants. Marx and Engels themselves were giants. And they were standing not only on the shoulders of giants, they were standing on the Enlightenment. They were standing on an entire era of giants. And what they did was achieved. It was not just the geniuses, the roots that they were drawing on and tying together. It was the time and the place as well. It all came together. Marxism couldn't have been invented hundreds of years earlier than it was. It was the fruit of its moment, and it's a beautiful moment. It's beautiful the way that it all came together right then and there. They lived in a time of intense social and philosophical ferment. The bourgeoisie was kind of rounding its peak, actually. Some of the best achievements in bourgeois thought were kind of coming to fruition right then and there, and Marx and Engels took it to its next level, and then it scared the bourgeoisie deeply because they realized what it meant for them. But you think about it, all the scientific breakthroughs that were taking place right then and there, cells were discovered in the 17th century, but only in the 1830s did they realize all plants and animals are made of cells. The first law of thermodynamics, the idea that energy transforms from one form to another, discovered right there within decades. Evolution, the idea that one species gives rise to another. These discoveries happened at a time that allowed philosophy to take a step forward. It gave rise to a more advanced form of materialism, more advanced form of understanding the material universe. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution was full steam. Those things were coming together, especially in England. Mechanization, the first application of large-scale mechanization to agriculture, I think in the 1830s was the first mechanical reaper. Think about what that changes for feeding the world. Steam production, rail. The first time that Marx and Engels met the second time they met, in 1844, a month earlier, the first telegraph had been sent. I mean, these things were taking place. It was all happening. And it was that those advances helped to unleash a new world outlook. I think also we should say Hegel, in particular, personified that era. It was the results of the Enlightenment, a 300-year period, but he kind of synthesized it. And all of that came together. They came out of that environment of the young Hegelian philosophy in Germany, which is a pretty narrow window of time. It's pretty awesome that they were then ready to take all of that. Hegel had an encyclopedic approach. He synthesized he was the first one to write a history of philosophy that runs through the whole thing, gives you a picture. Marx and Engels took that on board, but then they went from Germany into these new horizons. Engels to England, the roaring center of the Industrial Revolution. Marx to France, the site of the French Revolution, but also the site of French materialism. The key place to understand the fruits of the Enlightenment and to be able to tie all these things together. I want to talk about what they tied together, but first, this is something that I learned that I was really impressed and inspired by. There's something that gives you a flavor of the spirit of Marxist philosophy from the beginning. Marx was 23 years old when he wrote his doctoral thesis on the subject of two Greek materialist philosophers, Democritus and Epicurus, Greek atomists, who anticipated a very modern view of basically a modern materialist view of nature as early as the 5th century BC. Marx and Engels were very interested in the ideas of the ancient Greeks for many good reasons. They knew their way around it well, and a lot of the modern scientific thought had its roots in that period in a less developed embryonic form. But there's a striking comment in the preface. He wrote a foreword to his dissertation, and he makes a reference to the Greek myth of Prometheus. And the name was familiar. I don't really know my Greek mythology, so I looked it up. It's famous for its image of eternal torture. The Greeks have this imagery, right, of this guy, Prometheus, is chained to a rock, and an eagle comes and excruciatingly devours his liver, and then it grows back, and the next day it's repeated. And every day for eternity, he has to suffer this torture. The interesting thing is why he has to suffer it. The gods sentence him to that state of eternal torture for defying the gods to help humanity. Prometheus gave fire and the power of civilization to humanity, to lift humanity up, when the gods wanted the humans to be submissive. And they wanted them to be in the dark and powerless and ignorant, and Prometheus defied them. And his name means foresight or forethought. He knew what was going to happen, and he took the decision to help humanity lift up in defiance of the gods, even though there was going to be eternal suffering to pay for it. And when one of the servants of the gods approaches him and says, "Are you still happy with your decision?" He says, "Rest assured, for your vile slavery, I would never exchange my own unhappy lot." That was the line from Prometheus. He says, let me put it simply, I hate all the gods. Those are the words of Prometheus that Marx quotes in the foreword to his dissertation. And Marx says, Prometheus is the most noble saint and martyr in the philosophical calendar. It's a defiance of all the gods, all authority. That was a spirit of the ancient Greeks. That was a spirit that ran through the Enlightenment as well. The idea that the human mind is higher than these gods that have been created. We have the faculty of reason. We're capable of understanding, of getting to the truth by having as a starting point, there are no gods. This world wasn't made by gods. So let's start asking, how was it made? That's the beginning of a search for knowledge, for truth, for philosophy, for science. It begins by moving past religion. The Enlightenment spans, like I said, 3 centuries. It begins in the 16th century, starts to gain momentum in the 17th, and it really blooms in the 18th century, in the lead up to the French Revolution. And those great advances are basically successive steps in the direction of materialism. This idea that there is an objective reality independent of the mind, that the world is made of a material universe and there's one reality, there's no gods, and there's no pre-existence, there's no heaven or hell. It's a pretty straightforward, simple scientific idea to us today, maybe. But it was surprisingly difficult for humans to arrive at that basic stance, at a basic materialist stance. And for an entire period, for 1,000 years in the Dark Ages, there was an attempt to extinguish that idea in the Christian Middle Ages, the Dark Ages. The early shoots of the bourgeois Enlightenment were the shoots of pushing that back, something coming through the concrete a little bit. Let's start to question this again. Let's start to break this down. But at first it was very tentative. The early materialism came from British empirical materialists. Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, they were born in the 16th century. John Locke came later, he was born in the 17th. And they basically, reality comes from the senses. And so it's a beginning of like, let's look at objective reality. Let's treat this as a material world. Let's start to study it. But when it came to the question of God, they sort of sidestepped it. Well, we can only know reality through our senses, so we can't really know about God, so I don't really have much to say about that. And they kind of sidestepped it. They actually took the route of deism, right? Okay, there's a God maybe, but he just set this all in motion, and then he got out of the picture. He doesn't interact with us anymore, so it's a way of saying, okay, maybe there's a God, maybe there's not, it doesn't really matter. It's a partial step towards atheism. In the 18th century, this form of materialism was imported from Britain to France, and then the French took it to its logical conclusion. Before the French put Louis XVI in the guillotine, they put God in the guillotine. They were the ones that said, yeah. Bold, fearless, unflinching atheism. They had no fear. They were ready to bring it all down. And that's the kind of step in philosophy that prepares the way for a great revolution like the French Revolution. Now, as heroic and advanced as they were, French materialism was the height of the Enlightenment materialism. Condillac was the first that brought it in from Britain to France. Helvetius and Holbach were the others. There's a whole thread to follow there. By the way, follow it, comrades. Follow that thread. This is an amazing resource to have a proper understanding of how Marxism came out of, what those roots are, those rich roots. It's definitely worth history, philosophy. We're well stocked back there. Take them all, comrades. Make sure that we don't take any back. But there was a limitation to the materialism of the Enlightenment. They didn't apply materialism. First of all, it was very mechanical. It was limited by an idea of like Newtonian mechanics. The world is kind of on a balance. It's in an eternal circle, and it works as a machine. And even humans and animals work like machines. It had a it wasn't dialectical, And in addition, it didn't apply materialism to a view of human society. The materialists of the Enlightenment assumed that once you have humans that have a conscious will, well, basically they decide what they do, and then human society and human history is a result of what humans do, the ideas that they have. Idealism snuck back in when it came to looking at history. That's the thing that Marxism changed. That's the leap forward that brought materialism to its height. And ironically, it was Hegel who helped take that step. An extreme idealist helped bring materialism to its final conclusion. Because what was needed, the missing ingredient, was the dialectical method, which Hegel brought he systematized. And nothing is eternal. Hegel looked at everything as a part of a process. The materialists had gotten into the habit of, we need to analyze everything. Let's just classify it. Everything fits into its box. We need to put everything into its category. Hegel says the categories are giving rise to other categories. Everything is part of an unfolding process. Everything is in the process of becoming something else. It's an evolutionary perspective and a revolutionary perspective. Sometimes there's a leap forward. Everything contains something else within it, and it's in the process of becoming that other thing. That was the perspective that was required, because he looked at human history itself also as an unfolding process that had a direction. Humanity is moving in a direction. So Marx and Engels, what they did was they took that framework and they understood, they were able to say, what is that thread? What is the driving process? What is the direction? It's one mode of production giving rise to another. They said, even though humans have conscious desires, even though they think, humans don't decide what mode of production you're born into. And you don't realize how much that mode of production shapes your thinking and your environment and your upbringing and all the traditions and institutions that surround you. So it's not consciously decided. There are laws to history, and it's not determined consciously. It's determined by something else. What is that something else? It's the class struggle. It's the rise of the productive forces that have been given steps forward by one mode of production after another. Each mode of production has a certain ability to bring things forward, but it's limited. Eventually, the productive forces, instead of advancing, they start to get held back. And then you're prepared for another revolutionary step forward. That's the way the society unfolds. Marx and Engels were the first to apply materialism to human society, and the implications that flowed from that are what are Marxism today. I mean, that's the thing that they achieved. There is no mode of production that's eternal. That's a revolutionary idea, because it means the ruling class, it rules today, it's not going to necessarily rule tomorrow. No, in fact, no institution is eternal. The family structure itself, everything that we're told that is natural, that is normal, that is morality, laws, the authority of governments, all of that is in the process of becoming something else. And it's not that it's all random, it's that there are class interests behind it. The domination of a given ruling class is justified if it's advancing the productive forces. If it stops doing that and holds them back, it's no longer justified, which means there is a historical justification for bringing a ruling class down. These are powerful, very threatening ideas. In fact, this was the reason that the bourgeoisie went from using materialism as a weapon against feudalism, as against the absolutist monarchy, as against reaction, to realizing we've picked up a weapon that's dangerous. Put that down. And they did. They turned their back on materialism in one field after another. Look at the recent issue of In Defense of Marxism, The Fall of Woman, the article that Fred wrote. Anthropology had arrived at materialism with Morgan, and then they realized that's Bolshevism. Put that down. And then they went to Boas and said, no more materialism in this field. They did the same in economics, the labor theory of value. Wait, that means that workers' labor is producing all value. Well, then we have a class struggle, you know? Put that down. And they turned their backs on materialism in every social science. We had a little conversation about this last night. When was the turning point when the ruling class really went on the offensive? You know when it was? This was the turning point. 1917, they realized these aren't just threatening ideas. These people can take power with these ideas. That's when they went on the offensive against materialism. That's when they became the mortal enemies of materialism. And in the result, we see today, the bourgeoisie turned its back on the Enlightenment as a whole. They disavow the Enlightenment as a whole. That's what postmodernism represents. No, there's no progress at all. There is no truth. There is no reality. We're not interested in that anymore. There's nothing to learn from history. All of that, it really just scratches the surface. I really recommend not only that comrades read History of Philosophy, this final book pitch, this one, Revolutionary Philosophy of Marxism. We produced this in 2019. Just be careful. Be careful if you start highlighting this, because sometimes it's hard to stop. and then it turns into its opposite, and then you got to start underlining. But this is a powerful tool, comrades. This is really an achievement that this org. It's a compilation of the little bits and pieces, the gems of Marxist philosophy that have made it into all the classics, all in one package. In 2018, we put this together. There's an excellent introduction by Alan Woods in here. Alan Woods is working on a book on Marxist philosophy that basically puts it all together. Marx wanted to do that in his lifetime, didn't have the time to do it. Until that comes out, this is the next best thing, comrades. Don't wait for the other book to come out. Get this one first. And in 2019, the whole organization read it, and we had so many excellent discussions that really were a leap forward. That's what gave so many comrades a foundation. So get your hands on this and read it together with other comrades. It really describes, in particular, the Ludwig Feuerbach and the end of classical German philosophy describes how these threads were tied together. And I think it's such an inspiring, colossal achievement. But what do you do with an idea like that? Imagine that Marx and Engels, everything we've just described, it's pretty cool stuff, right? It's kind of mind-blowing. Imagine coming to this realization for the first time yourself with a buddy. Marx and Engels, and they realize that the things that they're submitting to the radical press are following the same thread. Actually, the revolutionary press at the time, it was the Deutsche Französische Jahrbucher. It's the German-French. Just an explanation of the way this worked. The Prussian state had rules on censorship for publications. It would have to all go through the censor. But if you had a 300-page book, it didn't count as a newspaper. So the censors didn't treat it the same way. So they would put all a year's worth of articles into one massive book. And in fact, all the writing that Marx and Engels did when they realized that they were following the same thread is in one massive book of like 300 or 400 pages. There was only one issue ever published of the Deutsche Französische Jahrbucher. But that's when they realized, imagine you open the book and you realize everything that this Marx guy is writing and everything that this Engels guy is writing from Manchester, from Paris, they're saying the same things. So then that's when they get into correspondence. That's when they realize the first time they meet in Paris, it was just a casual meeting. He's just traveling through. They end up a discussion that goes on 10 days. Imagine what that discussion was like. Imagine the excitement of it. Realizing the materialist conception of history, realizing that you've just tied together the things that brought philosophy to another step forward. You've just achieved what Darwin achieved for biology and more. You've just achieved that for human history. You've got a glimpse of the ideas that are going to lead to the next step forward from capitalism to a step towards a classless society. You can just imagine what kind of excitement and enthusiasm they were filled with in those 10 days in Paris. But what do you do with an idea like that? You get to work. You start finding ways to spread it. You find someone else by the ones and twos who can understand your idea, who can transmit it, who can absorb it. And of course, a good starting point is getting the ideas down on paper, so they wasted no time. Who was it, by the way, that said where to begin? With the revolutionary press. You got to begin with getting the ideas into a publication. That was Marx and Engels who said that, who answered that question in that way. And that's exactly what they did. Actually, while they were in that 10-day meeting in Paris, they already started polemicizing against the young Hegelians. Someone else had written something against the contributions of Marx and Engels, and they agreed. Let's just answer them, and they start polemicizing. They have a draft ready. They were gonna split the draft. 30 pages from Engels, 30 pages from Marx. Engels is very punctual. He would bang things out. He had his 30 pages ready to go at the end of the 10 days. Marx said, "I'm just gonna keep working on mine. I gotta." A few months later, he gets 300 pages from Marx, and that became the Holy Family. That was the first thing that they collaborated on. You read it, there's a lot of, I can't recommend reading the whole thing because it's extremely dense, but there's some sections that are brilliant, again, running through the history of Enlightenment materialism, which is in here, by the way. That excerpt you can find right in this book. But that's the way they started working. The next year, they wrote the German ideology together. Again, 700 pages. In the end, they couldn't find a publisher for it, but they said it was a process of self-clarification. They were finding out where they stood, and the way that they clarified their ideas was against other ideas. By polemicizing against other opponents, they would sharpen their own ideas. They would tear down the arguments of other opponents, but in its place, they would stand up materialism with example after example, with argument after argument. That's the way that Marxism came to be. Marx himself was a bit of a bulldog, by the way. If you see the polemics that he had against Proudhon, against all of these other thinkers of his time, there was a certain shared quality in the way that they would polemicize. So you can see elements of Bolshevism from the very first days. It was a sort of a Bolshevism of the 19th century. The original Bolshevism of Marx and Engels is a remarkable thread of continuity. It's very familiar, not just because they were polemicizing against other currents, not just because they had an insistence on precision of their ideas, but because they were building a Bolshevik organization, in effect. If you look at the way that they started building, it was by the ones and twos. It was contact work. The first organization that they had is one that's gone down in history, the Communist League, which had formerly been the League of the Just, right? With the slogan, "All men are brothers." And they tear it down. There's the movie, The Young Karl Marx. They tear down the banner and they put up "Workers of the World Unite" in its place. That was an organization that was won over from utopian communism to scientific socialism. An interesting thing that I learned is that in 1839, you think of, the League of the Just as kind of a wishy-washy, like, kumbaya, let's get along. It wasn't like that. They actually had organized an insurrection against the French government in 1839, together with Blanqui, and it was horribly failed. And from that experience, they went to London and started setting up reading groups. See, we need to figure out our ideas before we do something like that again. And there was a shift. You've seen that shift many times in history. The Narodniks went through a shift like that. We're going to throw a bomb under the Tsar, and that's going to be the revolution. Realizing that doesn't work. We need to have reading groups. You realize that the step towards revolution is on those shelves over there. You need ideas. You need clarification. You need a foundation. Many people have come to that realization at different points in history, in the history of the revolutionary movement. If you look at the first organization that they had, the Communist League, the structure of it was quite familiar. They had branches of between 3 to 10 comrades each. They met weekly for political discussion. They had lead-offs on perspectives. They had contact work, reading groups. They had aggregates, which they called banquets. They had weekly socials. Every Saturday they would have socials, at which they did singing to get the whole family together. It's familiar stuff. They had congresses. They had a pre-Congress period in the branches, and then they would discuss the documents that were drafted at a Congress level and elect national leadership. It's democratic centralism. It happened from the very beginning. It wasn't an invention that came later. It's the result of Marx and Engels figuring out, how do we get our ideas into the hands of the working class? How do we build an organization that is going to be rooted in these ideas? You need democratic centralism for that task. In 1847, when the Communist League tasked Marx and Engels with drafting the Communist Manifesto, the organization was our size today in the United States. They had 30 branches. They had just over 300 members. Actually, the following year, the 1848 revolution breaks out, and they all take up arms and join the barricade. They actually dissolve into the revolution. They went from theory to practice, right? It was a bit too soon, actually. They ended up falling apart and having to regroup. It was a very difficult period afterwards. And they regroup in the form of reading circles, workers' discussion groups. That's the way that Marxism took root for the first time. Actually, Engels, right after the defeat of 1848, I believe it was, immediately after, in Switzerland, he finds a contact, 22-year-old Wilhelm Liebknecht. Some of you might recognize that last name. His son was Karl Liebknecht. But he would go on to become a founding leader of the SPD. Years later, Wilhelm Liebknecht recruited another young communist who had found a booklet and became radicalized by a little booklet that he found in his 20s, a worker, August Bebel. The foundations of the mass forces of Marxism, which became a mass influence even by the end of Engels' lifetime, started with the ones and twos. It started with the cadres, that they spent countless hours discussing, corresponding with, all these letters, fixing trying to fix a lot of their problems, trying to educate. It was the ones and twos that created the foundation for something that became the strongest Marxist party in the world at its time. Right before World War I, it had over 1 million members, 15,000 full-timers, 90 daily newspapers, 62 print shops. That was the height of the SPD, when Marxism became a mass force. Of course, in Germany, as we said, in a country where there was a population with a certain intellectual tradition, a habit of thinking theoretically. But all of that, if you look at the final result, you could say, wow, look at an organization that has 15,000 full-timers and 62 print shops and 90 daily newspapers. And can get 4 million votes in the elections. It looks like this massive thing, but where did it begin? With the reading group. It began. Imagine going to that Congress in 1847, and one of the discussion documents is the manifesto, and the Congress can submit amendments to the manifesto. That was the beginning with those with the ideas, with the discussions. They were able to build the foundation of something solid. That's how Marxism sank roots. It's happened. There's only one way for Marxism to become a mass force. It's this way. It's Bolshevism. Going back to, I'm starting to run out of time, but some of the qualities that all the Marxists shared, and something that we all need as individuals to become Marxists is a deep respect for the power of ideas and study habits that were intense. You read about Marx in Paris when he's digging. He realizes that he's on the verge of a breakthrough. It's unhealthy, spending 3-4 nights without any sleep because he's just going from book to book, and he knows that he can sense that he's on the verge of something. He had a drive. In correspondence with his father, actually, his father said, I can tell that your soul is governed by a demon. I can't tell if it's a heavenly demon or a Faustian one, he says. But in any case, it was something inside of him, like something that gripped him, that he couldn't let go. All the great Marxists have had that. They've all tapped into that. You read about Trotsky saying, I strained every nerve in my body to understand the ideas. I couldn't, you're unsatisfied until you get them. You have to have that hunger in order to make that progress. If you don't have the hunger, you won't eat. You won't consume it. You won't be able to pursue it. But all the Marxists have had that, and I think it's something that we need to tap into. It's also not just an isolated thing. It happens from interaction. Imagine when Marx and Engels put their heads together and they realized, you've been doing this reading, I've been doing this reading. Boom, the effect of bringing that together. Or Trotsky, for the first time interacting with the Emancipation of Labor group, the editorial board of Iskra, his first exile in London in 1902. His eyes, once again, mind blown. Look at the quality. I have so much to learn. That's the thing that pushed him to say, I need to get to that next level. When we have those moments where we say, I just realized there's so much more to this than I appreciated, that's an opportunity for growth, comrades. That's something we can say, I'm going to be like Trotsky and strain every nerve in my body until I work through this entire pile, and that's the process. I think we've all had moments where we get a glimpse, where we fall in love with Marxism. You get a glimpse of how profound these things are, and it's a beautiful and necessary moment for our learning process. So that's an important idea in this resolution, is that becoming a Marxist is something to fight for. It's not something that happens automatically. It doesn't happen just through osmosis. And I think we also have to analyze, if you're inspired to raise your political level, then it's not enough to say, in the abstract, I want to read more, or I want to be a better Marxist. You have to have a battle plan. What is the change that you're going to make? What are the obstacles that stand in your way? And each of us have to figure that out for ourselves. We all have different things that are maybe holding us back on our study. In a general sense, you could say this country is working against a long time intellectual tradition, a version, not just like the influence of pragmatism and empiricism. It's not just the lack of any theoretical tradition in this country. We were talking to comrades about how hard it is sometimes. You're talking to a contact who's brand new to this stuff, for the contact to realize, we're fighting for a revolution. We think we can overthrow capitalism in our lifetime. And the most urgent way that we're preparing for it is this reading group that we have. And the contact is, wait, no, don't we need like guns? Or shouldn't we, there's a certain impatience. That impatience has deep roots in this country, by the way, and the impatience itself is an obstacle. If you want to have a really unyielding granite foundation, something really solid, if you want to achieve depth, if you want to send down a taproot in the political landscape of the United States, you can't be impatient. You have to have the depth. You have to fight for the depth, and you have to realize the things that are holding back the depth. So I think I hope to hear in the discussion what daily habits we can use to implement this. We threw out a few ideas in the resolution. Each comrade has to decide what changes they want to make in their own study habits. I think the important thing is reading every day, making a daily reading habit, finding a way to weave it into your everyday. Because if you just go to branch once a week, you're going to absorb something, but that's the slowest way to progress. If you're reading every day and you're reading for yourself, you look at your reading not as a chore, not as an obligation to your branch, not as a duty that you're assigned, but as something that nourishes you, as your daily, it's your steady diet of political inspiration, of theory. You're becoming a better Marxist by consuming this every day. Find the time, carve the time. Sometimes it's a question of how do you make the time to, to read. There's also, it's something that's becoming more rare. As we point out in the resolution, there's a lot of headlines I saw that say, if you used to love to read years ago, curling up with a book, and now you can't seem to get past a couple pages, you're not alone. And there's all these statistics about a decline, a sharp decline in society in reading habits. So that's, again, we're moving against that stream as well. Marx said that his favorite activity, his favorite pastime was bookworming. We have to become bookworms. We have to develop that habit, and if we didn't grow up with it, that's fine. You're a Bolshevik, so that's one of the obstacles that you can get over. We want to understand that you need to read if you want to be a revolutionary. You need to absorb that. Trotsky said socialism needs democracy like the body needs oxygen. We are Marxist cadres, require reading, require theory like the body needs oxygen. It's not a secondary thing, it's an essential thing. You need a steady diet of the ideas, specifically the classics, by the way. I know sometimes comrades say, do we need to, shouldn't we just branch out more beyond Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky? And in my experience, the problem isn't insufficient branching out, that comrades have too narrow of a diet. On the contrary, I think the more common danger is that you read a book and then you move on to the next title and you figure you're working your way through the classics without actually stopping and absorbing the content line by line. And that for me, that's confirmed every time I go back to it. And I realize even just reading the classics, Volume 1, the Manifesto, State and Revolution, Utopian Scientific, these amazing, brilliant texts. Yeah, they're short, we put them into an intro. That doesn't mean they're simple ABCs, watered down ideas. Those are rich things. Every time I come back to them, I realize this is so much more, there's so much more here than I appreciated last time I read this. So that was Trotsky's advice. When you're beginning, don't spread yourself too thin. It's not a race to read one book after another. I'd rather, instead of reading 10 books in a shallow way, read one in a very thorough way, follow the line of argument, line by line, follow the thread. The things that go over your head, stop and look them up. We have Wikipedia, we have the use of the internet as well to supplement. Follow it and make sure that you make it your own. That's the way that you can establish your own foundation. I just want to, wrap up saying that it's also a question of how Marxists are formed isn't just an intellectual thing. It's a question of it's linked to how revolutionaries are formed. The two go hand in hand. We also have to find time itself, find energy. The energy comes from the reading, but time management was always a concern for the great Marxists. Actually, you read the correspondence of Marx and Engels. Engels was the more punctual of the two. He was always telling Marx, it doesn't have to be perfect. Just get it published. We need this out. He was worried. Are we going to have enough? It was always projects that they wanted to get done. Tragically, a lot of projects that they weren't able to complete in their lifetime. But Trotsky himself as well. You read he wrote a diary that was published, a diary in exile from 1935-36 in France. He's talking about some of his own personal reflections. I need more time. He could see the writing on the wall. He could see what Stalin was doing to one after another of his relatives, even his non-political children, killing them. He could see what was coming. He had foresight. This is the person who said foresight over astonishment. He knew that he didn't have that much time. He needed just enough time to make sure that you could sink that root and it wouldn't be extinguished, that the taproot would not be severed. That's the thing, that was the task of his life. He was a Prometheus. He knew what was coming for him. He could see it. I mean, you see what happening in the Soviet Union. You could see the Stalinism thing. He knew that as an individual, he wasn't going to turn the tide against it. But he could give something to the struggle for the future. That's what Trotsky gave. He sank that root. And there was a moment, just like in the history of materialism, where it looked like for a long period it was going to be extinguished. Like this idea almost got completely, it almost disappeared. There was a period in the post-war boom after Trotsky's death when it looked like that flame was going to be extinguished, where it looked like it had come to the end of the unbroken thread. Ted Grant is the person who kept that flame alive, comrades. Ted Grant was the one who kept that unbroken thread from going out. It's thanks to Ted Grant that the organization now keeps that flame going. We're fanning that flame this weekend. We represent the unbroken thread. This organization looks at the ideas of Marxism and treats them in a way that no other organization on the face of this planet treats Marxist theory. There's no other organization that is doing what we're doing, that is trying to train cadres using the history of philosophy, using materialism and dialectics. In fact, even the bourgeoisie has turned their back on the Enlightenment, their own history of philosophy. There's no other phrase for the task of revolution in the only way that they can be prepared, comrades. So that's really the task that we have, how Marxists are formed. We have the ideas that we need. We just need to make sure that we form those Marxists, because Marxism on the rise depends on us being that force in the political landscape that carries the ideas into the battlefield. Let's prepare for battle, comrades.
If you are a member and you have not made plans and preparations to attend the 2024 Founding Congress of the RCA, definitely do that now. This discussion that you just heard is just an example of what kind of conversations we are going to have and the kind of conversations that you as a member need to be a part of to participate in the democratic process of our organization. If you're not a member and you want to attend this Congress, definitely reach out through the join link that will be in the description of this podcast. There's still plenty of time to prepare to get to this Congress. The only way that we will be able to make ourselves into Marxists and create a mass communist party for the first time is if we educate ourselves, build the granite foundation of Marxist theory, and organize very seriously. And that starts at the highest body of our organization, the Congresses. So any genuine communist should not miss this event. We hope to see you there.
We're asking a question with this session. The question is, what kind of party are we building? And this is based on an organizational resolution that is circulated through the ranks. It's essentially intended to be an instrument in your hands for sharpening our understanding of our mission, of what we are doing with this party that we founded a year ago, with the intention of gathering the first 10,000 Bolsheviks into our ranks. And we understand that that recruitment target, that drive, the first 1,000 and the first 10,000 is really just a stepping stone for creating a mass party. What we want to do with this document and with this discussion is understand more vividly, how is this party going to grow? How do we intend to proceed from where we are today to a mass point of reference, to bringing the RCA to the status of a household name? What type of organization is it? What is the nature of a cadre organization? What is the nature of Bolshevism? Really, it's opening the door to broader questions. Understandably, a lot of people want to have a very concrete, a very practical response to this. One of the comrades in Ventura, California, submitted to the portal a little report that we published in last month's issue of The Communist. It said, people often ask us, what does the party do? Comrades might be tempted to answer with a list of organizational points. We attend weekly meetings, study Marxism, go to protests. Instead, I tried to provide a vision of our strategy to overthrow capitalism. At our current stage, we're recruiting a layer that is already drawing advanced conclusions about the need for communism and revolution. We're building a network of Marxist cadres throughout the US, skilled revolutionary propagandists and agitators who will form the nucleus of a mass communist party. I used recent examples, BLM and the Palestine Solidarity Movement, to explain why we need a clear leadership and a program to succeed. As we get organized, revolutionary ideas will be a bigger point of reference in future mass movements, and we need Bolsheviks in every key workplace, neighborhood, campus, and union, starting with you. The comrade said, everyone I explained this to was ready to give their contact information, and one even asked me point blank how he could become one of the first 10,000 Bolsheviks. Said he would sign up for dues when he got home. I think this is a model response. And what we wanted to do with this document and with this session, understand more deeply what is the entire strategy, because if we can see the strategy clearly, then everything else will flow from that. And I think the United States has a very impatient, sort of pragmatic temperament. I remember having a small group of comrades in one of our first iterations of a branch back in California, in the small town, rural Northern California that I grew up in, having a meeting about revolution. And it just so happens we were on the high school campus, the sidewalk's right here. One of my cousins walks by, sees us, oh, what are you guys doing? And I'm trying to get him to go away, and I said, look, we're having a meeting. Oh, well, what's the meeting about? Well, it's about revolution. And his response kind of sums up what people think when you say that word. He said, oh, do you need guns? We said, not at this stage, thank you. But a lot of people, and I would say the vast majority of people, the vast majority of the left, people who want to have a revolution, having that goal doesn't necessarily give you a clear understanding of how to arrive at a force that's capable of making that possible. And I think that's the nature of Bolshevism, is getting to the heart of this thing. It's always been a difficult thing for people to understand. How do you build the right kind of instrument? It's a very modern question. This question was answered for the first time in this book, What is to be Done? And I think this is the book you can read over and over and get more and more from each time that you read it. Admittedly, it's not easy to read the first time around. It assumes that the reader is swimming in certain waters. It's written for an audience of Russian revolutionaries in 1902 who understand the recent history of their movement, the debates that are raging. It's a polemic. But once you understand, once you get to the heart of what's being argued, all the content is there. Everything that you need in order to understand what it's going to take for us to build this kind of party, to build modern day 21st century Bolshevism, is contained in Lenin's argument. And what was happening at that time was that the revolutionary movement was boiling up. It was raging. The number of people that wanted to overthrow the Tsar were it was a human tidal wave. And they were rushing into the revolutionary movement. In fact, the Tsarist prisons were overflowing with revolutionaries, and Tsarist prison cells were a sense of a cadre school. It was a university. You get locked up for 5 years, and there's not much you can do except read and write and think. And a lot of cadres got their education, not in a very pleasant setting, but in a pretty effective one, after all. Lenin was one of these. He was arrested in 1895, 1 year after moving to St. Petersburg, and spent the next 5 years in Tsarist prisons and in exile camps. And I think you can imagine that he was basically cooking this up. What is to be done was a product of that long period of thinking about what the movement needed. But every time the Tsarist police would come and carry out raids and sweep away one layer of leadership, another wave would pour forward, and it would just keep growing. The problem is there was a very low political level in general. You had a network of discussion groups, but you didn't have any kind of professionalism. There was no central force to coordinate it. And so Lenin could understand that you needed to bring this thing together, you needed to concentrate it and give it professionalism. He was fighting against primitive methods, against amateurism, and he understood something that nobody else really did, at least at a degree that no one else really did, is that if you want to give it that hardened core and professionalize a force like that, that's not an organizational, administrative, technical task. That is a political task. It's an ideological task. And what that means is the step you need to take is the step of training cadres deeply and thoroughly in revolutionary theory. Now, we can put the important information, put the bottom line up front. That's what we need to do today. That is the one key to our strategy from which everything else flows, to raise our political level, to train cadres, to train hundreds and then thousands of cadres. That is the only way for us to get to 10,000, but not just to grow in numbers, but to grow in quality, to become the kind of force that can actually wield influence and be a factor in the situation. Understandably, a lot of impatient young leftists don't like this answer. And they didn't like it at the time Lenin put it forward either. They called him, well, they didn't use the word theory, bro, but, and they didn't say theory is elitist as such. Actually, they probably did make that argument. But they said that he was overrating ideology, that he was obsessed with literary, intellectual work, that it would be better if revolutionaries focused on concrete issues, practical material demands, make it realistic. They had a high regard for spontaneity. They said, this is what's happening spontaneously. The workers are moving. We should just be supporting them. Essentially, they were arguing to tail end the movement of the working class. And Lenin fought against this severely throughout what is to be done. The first chapter is all dedicated to this. You need to sharpen, and you need a high level before you can unite. He said, in order for us to unite, we need firm lines of demarcation. You need to recruit people around a theory and around a program. That is the thing that you're recruiting people to. And if you do that from the act of uniting people around a single worldview, and I think we're making progress in this room. I think we have a single worldview represented in these ranks and in the RCA today. We've come a long way. If you do this, certain things will flow organizationally from that. If you have people that think like Marxists and they have the same method when they're analyzing events, if they have a shared understanding of the mission they're trying to fulfill in history, then it creates a certain mentality, and you get iron discipline that's a voluntary revolutionary discipline based on commitment. And that's the way that you fight amateurism. These methods that you had, basically lack of coordination, a lack of agreement, people rowing in different directions. If you want a force that's powerful and yet flexible and agile, something that's steadfast, that's not going to break apart when it gets tested under strain of events, then you need people, you need to build it out of special material, and that's people that understand history, how history unfolds, the laws of history, and their role in that process. And that's exactly what the Bolsheviks achieved. In a sense, what is to be done is like the mission statement. In Russian, что делать?